Mr. Keesling's going to come with us now. Well, he is the chairman of the board, and I will afford him that. Yesterday was the 4th anniversary of us coming back to Wichita from Texas, and yesterday was our first full day in Wichita 4 years ago, and we immediately came back to Asbury, and as we kind of dug back in, got to know people in Sunday school class that I hadn't met before, and Bob was one of those, and his wife were in a class, and getting to know people that I hadn't had the opportunity to meet before, and getting to reestablish relationships with people from before, and it's been really good, and I've enjoyed from time to time Bob teaching in Sunday school. He brings a lot of insight, and it's very interesting, and he leads us through things, and I've been able to serve on the leadership board with him before he went to the administrative board. And I just appreciate Bob and his thoughtfulness, and certainly at this time of transition and everything that's going on, he's been able to help keep us up to date, along with Rick, about what's been going on, and that's been a lot of it's been comforting to know that we've got good heads representing the church. But anyway, right now I just want to welcome Bob up and ask him to come and share what God's been doing, and tell us what is this prevenient grace of which you speak.
Maybe we'll know here in a little bit. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for letting me be here, and thank you, Stan, for inviting me to do this. As you can see, Stan told me part of the deal was I had to come up with a title for what I was going to talk about. So, as you can see, I've entitled this "Prevenient Grace Must Be Real." Well, how many of you think you know what prevenient grace is? A few. Probably more of you do than what you realize. If I can get this to work. It's a Wesleyan thing, and since we're Wesleyans, why, that's of interest to me. You can see the years that Wesley was around. He has 3 categories of grace that he focuses on: prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying. And to me, it's kind of the forgotten one of the 3 is prevenient grace. A lot of people will talk about justifying and sanctifying grace, but outside of the Wesleyan world, I'm not sure how much they talk about prevenient grace. A couple of definitions that I found. Prevenient grace is a really large term, but to keep it simple, it is grace before we knew we needed it. It is God's provision for us before we knew it and before we were aware of it. Well, Bob's even simpler definition is it's God pursuing us. So in this morning, I'm going to share with you some examples where, with the benefit of hindsight, I feel like maybe God was actually pursuing me throughout the course of my life. I'll share with you my story. It's not all of it's pretty necessarily.
Hey, whoa, nice.
I probably didn't know, particularly at that stage in my life, what prevenient grace was, but I was trying to kind of look like John Wesley a little bit with the hair and everything, you know. And yeah. The sad thing of it is, my hair was actually a little longer at one point in time. That's as I started to come out of that phase of my life. I am a 6th generation Methodist. I can track it back at least that far. Have one branch in my family that was Church of Christ, and that was all pretty local, in Reno and Stafford County is where a lot of that family came from. I did have a period of my life, that picture would represent part of that period, where I really wasn't very close to the church, nor was I living in a very Christian way of life. So I am also one, I cannot report to you a particular date and time of a conversion experience that I have had. that bothered me for a while, particularly as I started growing and learning more about things. I really began to wonder, well, you know, have I or not? Well, on my way home from work one day, it's been a number of years ago, I used to listen to a station that had a program on about that time called The Bible Answer Man. Hank Hanegraaff was his name. And somebody called in that day with kind of the same situation that I had. You know, I can't tell you date and time, and things like that. Well, his answer helped me a whole lot on that. He said, well, consider this. He says, if you got on an airplane in Dallas and you got off an airplane in Mexico City, he said, somewhere along that flight, you crossed the border of the United States into Mexico. He said, you don't know exactly when that was, but he said, if you in fact did get off the plane in Mexico City, he said, you were there. Yeah. You crossed that border at some point in time. You know, that was kind of a relief to me to think that, you know, maybe I am there. My story goes as this. I was born in Hutchinson, Kansas, February 6, 1953, at the old Grace Hospital, which was a Methodist hospital. They used to have two. Now they have one. Last I saw anything about the Grace Hospital building, it was somebody was considering turning it into apartments or something like that, and it was an empty building full of bird poop at that particular point in time. So things do change with time. I am an only child, so everything you've ever heard about only children is probably true, and you're seeing it right here in front of you. Chet and Eleanor Keesling were my parents. My father died back in 1993. He was 2 days short of his 80th birthday. My mother is still alive today. She's 96 years old and lives at Asbury Park Retirement Community up in Newton. The last 2 years she's been in a greenhouse, which is their delivery model for nursing care. It's one of their delivery models up there for nursing care. She's really still doing pretty well, and she's a great person, I'll have you know. I believe very much in the concept of standing on the shoulders of giants, and I've had the privilege in my life to do that. Apologize for the formatting situation going from what I have to what this one is. Things shifted just a little bit, but these are some of the family names that make up my life, and they are some of the shoulders that I stand on. The Keesling family and some of the names that you'll see under there that make up that side of my life. My mother's maiden name was Wells, and some of these names in that column make up that background right there. There's a few I'll point out to you. If you go in the left-hand column, about 2/3 of the way down, you see the name Yust, Y-U-S-T. Well, my great-grandmother clothier was Louisa Yust. And I've told Rick a little bit of this story, but I have more details right now. Her father, in the information I have, was Charles Friedrich Just, or if you had a German brogue, Just. Right. Okay? His father, which would be my great-great-great-grandpa, was named Gottfried Sigmund Just, J-U-S-T, Just. So, maybe long-lost cousins, I don't know. Yeah. We'll have to check that out. On there's a lot of German in my background. There's some other things on the right-hand column right here. Two I wanted to point out to you right there. The Wells name, my maternal grandfather, my mom's dad, was a Methodist pastor. He was almost 50 years in the pastorate. He, according to some newspaper articles that I have, was considered to be the last horse and buggy circuit rider in western Kansas. And that was a circuit that came out of Liberal, kind of to the east and south a little bit from the little burgs out there. He he was born in Indiana, but actually ended up his family moved to the panhandle of Oklahoma, a little town just south of Elkhart, Eva, Oklahoma. And Grandpa started out as a teacher back in the days when you didn't have to have a college degree to teach. He taught for a while and then felt the call to ministry. His first papers were in the Methodist Episcopal Church South. So that goes back quite a ways. It was somewhere in the 19-teens when he started in ministry. Went all over the place. Mom, being a child of a pastor, lived in a whole lot of different places back in the days when they moved you even more often than what they do today. So Grandpa also went to Garrett Theological Seminary, which is where Rick went. That would have been back in the 20s, I think. He went to Southwestern College in Winfield first, and then up to Garrett. If you go down about 2/3 of the way there's the name Dodge right there. And that is my great-great-great-grandfather, Jonas Dodge. And he was also a Methodist pastor back in the Genesee Conference in New York State, upper New York. And ultimately he came out to Kansas. Not sure. The family lore has it that he was sent out to minister to the Indians. I don't know if that was true or not, but he ended up first in Doniphan County, Kansas, which is the northeasternmost county in the state of Kansas. And I have a piece of furniture that he actually built, part of a piece of furniture that he actually built. And the story goes that he felled the tree, sawed the lumber, and built the furniture out of it. So it's not very fancy, believe me, but it's pretty special to me, thinking that that came from him. He ultimately ended up in Lawrence and died there in 1859, and I've tried to find a gravestone or something when I've been up there, and I've not succeeded in finding that yet. But he was considered, when he was back in New York, he was called a presiding elder. And some of what I can find says that might be similar to a district superintendent today. Others indicate it was more like a circuit rider, so I don't know. He did some, I'll share some other things with you a little bit later. He did some circuit riding, serious circuit riding, while he was in the ministry back there. Then, you know, every family has some characters in it. And if you, on this right-hand column, the third name down, Dupuis is how you pronounce that. It's a French name. And he, according to family lore, was either a stowaway or a stolen child, is how he ended up in this country. He somehow ended up in the state of Indiana. I have actually found his gravestone in the cemetery in Ligonier, Indiana. And he wanted to join the Union Army during the Civil War. Well, being in Indiana, being the Union Army and everything, having a French name wasn't a very good idea. So Dupuis in French apparently means by the fountains or by the wells. So he adopted the name John Wells so he could enlist. Well, that's where the Wells name came from, was from Vinal Dupuis was his full name. Well, the character side of him is that he had one family as Vinal Dupuis, and he had another family as John Wells. Separate towns. They were only about 7 miles apart, but that was quite a ways back in those days, you know. So interesting. His son was also named John Wells, who was my great-grandfather. And I think he was a bit of a character too. Kind of family lore has that he probably ran a bar back in Cromwell, Indiana, which I've been there too. And that's where my grandfather, pardon?
The bar.
The bar was closed when I was there. So, story has it that things were getting a little heated back there for some reason, and so that's how they ended up out in the panhandle of Oklahoma. And believe me, if you're trying to get away from something, the panhandle of Oklahoma, not a bad place to go. It'd be one of the few reasons you'd want to stop there, I think, probably. Yeah, but they did that, and interestingly enough, from that character background came my grandfather, almost 50 years a Methodist pastor, and his youngest brother, my great-uncle Paul, was a physician who was actually MacArthur's chief medical officer in the South Pacific during World War II. So, you never know what can happen. And two of the most faithful men that I've ever met in my life were my grandpa and his brother. So anyhow, there may be some names you recognize. There may or may not be a connection right there. I grew up on a little farm just north of Sylvia, Kansas, which is about 20 miles west of Hutchinson. We had a Plevna mailing address, a Sylvia phone, and Sylvia school system. So I went through grade school at Sylvia. We had mostly wheat and alfalfa and cattle. And while I was growing up, I was actually working on my own little small herd of registered Angus cattle. So I was kind of into that sort of thing. And we lived there until I was about 12 years old. Some of the markers, I'm going to share with you some markers in my life that I've been able to identify as things that might qualify as prevenient grace. And one of the first ones, I don't personally remember this, but I was actually baptized as an infant by my grandfather. He was the pastor at Atwood, Kansas at that time, and story has it that my dad in those days had an airplane, an old T-craft. It was a tail dragger, two-seater, but they could get in there, he and Mom, and then Mom would hold me on her lap, and we flew from this farm north of Sylvia to Atwood for baptism. So that has grown in importance to me over the years. Of course, when I was a kid, it didn't really mean a lot. The older I've gotten, the more special that has become to me. So I really feel like that's one of the early things. Went through 6th grade at Sylvia Grade School. School's not there anymore. All the unification and those kind of things, and the building's even gone now. But the memories are still there. I was typically one of the last ones to be picked for teams and games in recess. Softball game, old Bob would be standing over, you'd pick your sides, and here I was. Didn't bother me a whole lot, but in the 6th grade, I was watching some older boys. These were probably 8th graders, real old, and they were doing something. They had this round iron ball that they were picking up and trying to throw it a ways. And I was kind of intrigued by that, so I tried that myself and actually competed in one track meet in the 6th grade. It was probably the Reno County League with Arlington and Langdon and some of these other little towns over in that part of the world. But later on in my life, that had quite an impact. Some other markers that I can identify. We started out, there was a little Methodist church 1.5 miles from where our farm was called Huntsville Methodist Church. And it closed maybe 10 years ago, something like that. They had about a 130th anniversary celebration, and then they closed. Well, Mom decided we should go into town to the Methodist Church in Sylvia, where Jim Beebe's dad was pastor at one time, not then, and that was before Jim or I, either one, were around. But we went in there, and a few years ago, we went back to the church at Sylvia. They were having it was their 126th anniversary, but they didn't get around to having a 125th celebration, so they were kind of celebrating both of those things at that time. And I realized that I had a lot of memories from that place that I didn't consciously think about or know. I came in there and I realized that is where I learned the Lord's Prayer. That's where I learned the Apostles' Creed, which I can still recite to this day. back in those days, we did it every week. And I was there every week. And so something sunk in along the ways. Another thing that they did, and a lot of churches do, they handed out Bibles to you in the 3rd grade. And I got mine. It's even got my name printed on the front of it. This is the Revised Standard Version, which was pretty common back in those days. And I still use this today. This is the Bible that I use for my daily devotions. And you know, that's been quite a while ago that they, whether they realized it or not, they had an impact on me, and I bet on a whole bunch of other people, as many churches have done, if they will continue to do that kind of thing. So those are some markers kind of from my childhood. My dad had 3 very distinct careers. He was first of all an electrical contractor. They lived out in western Kansas. He grew up, he graduated high school in 1932, and so this was the Depression, which led to World War II and those kind of things. And after Dad got out of the Army, why he went to a trade school up in Chicago. He had planned to go to college, but he had put his money, this was back closer to his high school days, he'd put his money in a bank on Friday, and the bank never opened its doors again. So what money he had worked so hard to set aside for college was gone. So did what he could do and learned to become a very good electrician, actually, and went out to western Kansas and had his own business. That's where he first got his airplane. You could justify it back in those days, because these grain elevators and things like that, if they had a breakdown and they needed a part, they were willing to pay for it. So Dad could fly. There was a place in Great Bend, I guess, that had a lot of electrical equipment, and he would fly to Great Bend, get the parts, fly back out to Sublette or that area out in there, and get them back up and running. So they did that. Then he felt the call when my grandfather was going to quit farming. He felt the call to come back to the farm where he was actually born, and that's where I came into the picture, was during that time. And then we reached this next juncture in my life, and farming is physically pretty challenging. And Dad's physical condition wasn't bad, but it was just getting real hard on cold mornings like this. You had cattle. They needed you no matter what the temperature was. So it was getting to be a challenge. So Dad switched gears again and became a stockbroker. Well, he worked for this great little company out of Emporia called West America Securities, and they wanted somebody out in southwestern Kansas. Why don't you move to Liberal? Okay. So we were going to move from Sylvia to Liberal, and we did. I went 7th and 8th grades at West Junior High and Liberal, and then 4 years of high school at Liberal High School. That's where I graduated from. But during that change, I didn't want to move. I was kind of a stubborn little brat through this whole process. Liberal, when you live in Wichita, Liberal doesn't seem like a very big place. When you live in Sylvia, Kansas, Liberal's huge. I'm telling you, it is a huge place, and I just couldn't imagine wanting to live in some place like that. So, believe it or not, I negotiated with my parents. I don't know why they put up with me doing all that kind of thing, but well, okay, if I've got to go, I'll go, but I won't stay in band. I played a trombone. I had to play a trombone solo in church one time. For a long time, that was the only thing I ever remembered about church, was the embarrassment of having to get up there and play a trombone solo. I said I wouldn't do that. I said I wouldn't go to Sunday school. I said, don't even think about a youth group or anything like that. Ain't doing it. Well, as it worked out, we moved. My decision was to stay with my parents, if I had a choice in that. Went to school the first day in the 7th grade out there. Must not have liked it very well, because when morning came for the second day, I wasn't going to go. I was stubborn as all get out. I wasn't going to go. Well, we talked for a little bit, and then Dad removed his belt. He never had to use it, but he made his point that I was in fact going to go to school that day. And I did, and apparently by the time I got home that night, I was all smiles and things were good. And the third day from there on out, it was a good move for me. It really, I was able to do a lot more in a bigger school than I could ever have done. I would have gone to high school at Fairfield High School. Some of you may have heard of that. It's right around Langdon in western Reno County out there. So anyhow, things progressed from there. I became involved junior high, high school, both in athletics, and I played football, basketball, and was involved in track and field. Well, football I continued clear through high school. Basketball I played through about my sophomore year, and then there was one time they wouldn't let me start practicing track until the full basketball season was over, and I didn't like that, so I never played basketball again. Plus I wasn't very good at it. Track and field stuck with me. Stuck with me enough that I really excelled at it. I did pretty well. This little iron ball that I talked about just a little bit ago, that's what I did. I was a shot putter and discus thrower, ultimately. And one of the highlights of my high school days was that in my senior year, we went to the KU relays. And back in those days, the KU relays was a big deal. They had Olympians there, they had world record holders there, they had high schools from several states that would show up. There was a circuit, the Texas relays, the Kansas relays, and then the Drake relays. And all these star athletes would hit all three of them because they came on kind of successive weekends. Well, I got up there and I actually broke the oldest record in the books for the high school shot put. Well, that was kind of a big deal. And the next day, we had the discus. I should not have won that, but somehow I won the discus throw up there too. It wasn't record setting by any means, but if you've ever followed the KU relays, it always rains during the KU relays. And it was doing that this day, and I was the only one that was persistent enough. I would take a towel and grind it into the concrete circle from which you throw the discus so that my foot wouldn't slip when you go to spin around like that. Other people that were actually better discus throwers than I was didn't do that. They slipped or enough that it threw them off, and I was able to win that. I think it was that second day, and I can still visualize this, in the southeast corner of the stadium. I sat there with one of the coaches from the University of Nebraska, and they offered me a scholarship. And so, you know, just that whole weekend was a pretty big deal. We came back through Sylvia area, the farm, to see my grandma, and she was just all smiles because the Hutchinson newspaper, for whatever reason, had this headline that said, "Liberals Keesling breaks oldest record." Well, seeing the look on my grandma's face was worth a lot more than what the headline in the newspaper was, but you know, that was a pretty big thing, and it led me to have to make some pretty big decisions. I had full ride offers from the University of Nebraska, the University of Oklahoma, and if you're familiar with liberal, it's right on the Oklahoma line. There's every bit as much OU influence out there as there is anything else. University of the Pacific, which is in Stockton, California, they offered, I never did go visit there, but they offered me one. KU offered me a half scholarship. That's probably where I would have preferred to go, but half versus full, I was mercenary, you know, didn't do that. And then Columbia University in New York City was interested in me both playing football and doing track. And the disadvantage there is that it was a long ways from home. They had no athletic scholarships, and it was really expensive. So I went so far as to apply there, and I got accepted, but that really wasn't under consideration. So it was basically down between Nebraska and OU where I was going to go. And you know, I visited both places, realized that after my visits, I just felt more comfortable at the University of Nebraska. One thing was OU had a jock dorm where you had to live, and Nebraska didn't. You lived in regular student housing, and that just appealed to me as much as anything. But during this high school phase of my life, I don't have a whole lot of markers there other than the fact that in spite of my stubbornness, I would go to church. I wouldn't go to Sunday school, I wouldn't go to youth group or anything like that, but I did. Mom sang in the choir, so a lot of times I sat out there by myself. Sometimes my dad went too, but I did do that much at least, and I think that's probably an example again of God nudging me a little bit on that. So anyhow, I chose the University of Nebraska. It was a pretty heady time to be there, actually. I graduated high school in 1971, and the fall of my senior year, Nebraska won the national championship in football that year. My freshman year up there, Nebraska won the national championship in football again. So 2 years in a row, you know, it was a pretty big deal up there, especially when you were in school there. It was really a big deal. I got to be around Heisman Trophy winners. I got to be around Outland Trophy winners. Can't say I was buds with them, but you know, I worked out with them. I shared training table. We had our own place that we got to eat, which we ate a whole lot better than the general student population did, believe me. And one of my fellow shot putters ultimately became the super heavyweight weightlifter on the 1980 U.S. Olympic team. So his name was Jerry, and he was from Levittown, New York, and that was kind of interesting to get to know somebody from back in that part of the world. You know, he bounced his ball down the wall, the hall, off the wall, and you know, and he drank soda instead of pop, things like that. One day, Jerry and I were coming out of this building where our locker room and weight training and things like that was, and there were some little kids out there, and they came running up to us wanting our autograph. And so, oh yeah, sure, we signed our autograph, and then they took off, and pretty quickly we realized that, you know, being shot putters, we were both pretty big guys, and the kids thought we were football players, you know. So anyhow, that was one of those little come down moments that, you know, don't think too much of that kind of thing. I was there during the transition. If any of you know anything about Nebraska football, Bob Devaney was the coach up there, and my first 2 years in school, he was the head football coach. Then he retired, and the first 2 years of Tom Osborne's tenure up there was my junior and senior years. Osborne had been an assistant coach under Devaney, and there were some other. Warren Powers ultimately became a head coach different places. Monty Kiffin, who may still be coaching in the NFL, was up there, and Lane Kiffin is his son. I think Lane was probably born while I was in school up there, and he's bouncing around the college football world right now. But not only was it kind of a heady experience to be around some of that, but the football success really helped the track program. They generated a whole lot of money, and track generates no money on its own, but you can live off the proceeds of a football team. So it was all pretty good. As you can imagine, you know, I was 18, 19, 20 years old during that time frame. With those kind of experiences, you kind of need to learn humility at some point in time. So here's one of my markers for you, and this was at the start of my freshman year. Going to Nebraska, being from Liberal, Kansas, I knew absolutely nobody else there. Not only that, being from out of state, I had to take some extra entrance tests and things like that, so I had to go up early for that. The dorm I was supposed to live in was not open yet, so they were putting me up in another dorm for a few days until I could move into my regular one. My parents had taken me up there, but they had to get back to Liberal. I had no car. By the time I got back into my temporary dorm room, the food service had closed for the day. So here, I still ate a lot. Not that I don't today, but I still ate a lot back in those days. And gosh, I was pretty hungry, but there was no food there, so I took off walking. I eventually found some kind of You probably would call it a convenience store today. I'm not sure what it was called back in those days, but someplace I could buy a candy bar at least. So I was walking back towards this temporary dorm and had a pretty strong dose of woe is me going on, you know, probably even had a tear in my eye. And, you know, my parents were gone, I don't know anybody, I'm hungry, all these kind of things. So about that time I was walking under this tree and a Nebraska bird decided to welcome me to Nebraska. Well, that kind of helps you put things in perspective just a little bit as you're trying to get that off your head, and nobody even to share the experience with right then, you know. Then at the end of my freshman year, God decided it was probably time to bring a little humility into my life again. Over spring break, we didn't get a break. We had to go and have track meets. So we took off and we flew, even back in those days, and went to Arizona State, to Phoenix, Tempe area. And we had a track meet out there, got to do a little training while we were there, got to experience being in the weight room. The guy's name was John Cole, and he was, back in those days, being an AAU champion was a big deal. And he was a rare commodity. He was the AAU champion in both the discus and powerlifting. Which, I mean, this guy, and he was a professor of some sort at Arizona State at that time. So we went in to work out in the weight room, and he was in there working out. Weight rooms were a lot different back in those days, not nearly as sophisticated as they are today. But we went in there to work out, and because he was there, he had every weight in the weight room on the bar that he was doing deadlifts, and then he did incline presses and things like that, and it was just, wow, way beyond anything I'd ever seen before. But we went from there down to El Paso, UTEP, University of Texas at El Paso. UTEP was one of the first schools in the nation to start recruiting foreign athletes. And they recruited them for their track program, and they had some really outstanding people down there. They had a sprinter that was lights out, and his name was Harrington Jackson. Well, he had a nickname, JJ. And when we had our track meet down there, they had an announcer that would really trumpet things. He would hype things up quite a bit. He was rounding the curve, and the announcer would come on the stadium and say, and coming around the bend is Harrington J. Jackson. You know, they just made a big deal out of it, which was pretty good because track didn't always get the publicity that a lot of us thought we should. Well, they were only the second school to ever have 3 60-foot shot putters at the same time, and they did. And one of them, their best one was named Fred DiBernardi. And he was the returning NCAA champion in both the shot put and the discus. And then they had a couple other, one Swedish guy, his name was Hans Hoagland, and the third one, I can't remember his name, but Fred DiBernardi had a nickname, Debo. And so Debo was putting the shot right before me, and he got out there and he let one crank, and they reached it out and they measured it, and he broke the record at the stadium at the University of Texas at El Paso, and that record had been held by Randy Matson, who was the current world's record holder in the shot put at that particular point in time. So the stadium announcer that I had been describing, he gets on there and was telling everybody, focus your attention on the shot put ring. Debo has just broken the record held by world's record holder Randy Matson. Well, just about that time, the guy running the event goes, Keesling, Nebraska, you're up. So the people that were being focused down there weren't watching Fred DiBernardi put the shot, they were watching Bob Keesling put the shot. Well, this is a shot put ring, and you see those little, you have your vector lines, and then you have those arcs out in there that are measurements, so that when you're getting ready to throw, you can kind of set your eye on where you want to go. The soil down in El Paso is nasty. It's just awful. And because of that, they had actually come in and dug out where some of these arcs are and had replaced that nasty soil with better stuff. Well, it just so happened, having 3 of the best shot putters in the nation at that particular point in time, they started a little bit farther out with this good soil. So here came Keesling of Nebraska, and he puts the shot, and the shot lands short of the good soil. This nasty clay soil just consumed my shot put. It sunk. It plopped into this clay soil, and while everybody was focusing their attention on the shot put ring, I had to go and dig my shot out of this muddy, nasty soil out there. So anyhow, that was enough to last me for quite a while as far as establishing humility in my life. Some of you in this room will remember the 1970s. This was the early 70s when I was doing this stuff. And it was kind of a nasty time in our country. You know, you had the Vietnam War going on, you had free love, you had drugs really making their first major appearance on the scene anyhow. And it was just kind of a nasty time, and it really wasn't one of the greatest times for me either. I arrived at college with declared a major in the School of Engineering, but I was undeclared. I didn't identify whether it was to be electrical or mechanical or whatever on that. But fortunately, they required you to take an Intro to Engineering class. And I did that in my first semester, and readily realized, this is back in the slide rule days. Any of you remember slide rules? Yeah?
I still got one.
Still got one.
Yeah.
Well, I readily realized that, you know, I don't really think I want to do that. And so I had to decide again what I wanted to do. My mother had been a teacher. She ended up being a teacher for about 40 years, and I loved what she did, and that was a major influence on me. So I changed my major to math. I was a mathematics major in the Teachers College at the University of Nebraska. Did my student teaching at East High School in Lincoln, Nebraska, which was a good experience. It was a very large school, and I can't think what it would compare to around here. It was part of the Lincoln district, but it was more like one of the suburban schools. It was pretty affluent and things like that. So it was a relatively good experience. Some of the markers during that time in my life were kind of hard to find because of my lifestyle that I had. But 2 things I did back then, as I'm able to look back with hindsight, that had to be God's prevenient grace working in my life, is I had this Bible with me. Can't really tell you why I took it with me, but I did. And I actually read it from cover to cover during that period of my life. And, you know, to this day, I can't really tell you why I was doing that. And for a long time, that was the only time I had read the Bible from cover to cover. But I did. And the other thing that I did, which I really don't have any explanation for other than God's prevenient grace, is I prayed. I didn't probably do it as much as I should, but I did occasionally do that. And I have to think that was probably God nudging me again a little bit. Well, I came out of college, graduated, came out able to teach both math and psychology. I didn't really plan on the psychology part, but I took enough ed psych classes that I had enough psychology hours that I was qualified to teach that. About 1 class short of being able to teach physics. Well, I never went ahead and took that other 1 class, but could have if I needed to. So I had a couple of friends that were heading off to law school at SMU in Dallas. And I looked around Nebraska a little bit, Kansas a little bit. I thought, well, yeah, maybe about Texas. Kansas and Nebraska, neither one paid extremely well to teachers. Nobody did back in those days. But Texas actually paid just a little bit better. So I thought, I'll go down there. you know. So I interviewed at a number of districts in and around the Dallas, Texas area, and began my first post-college job teaching in Dallas, Texas. I learned something in the process of that. I signed an unassigned contract with the DISD, Dallas Independent School District. Well, I didn't really know what that meant. It meant I had a job. But I come to find out if you sign an unassigned contract, that means you're going to be placed in the worst school in the district. And Dallas has a lot of schools, and quite a few of them that aren't very good. So anyhow, I found out that I was assigned to LG Pinkston High School. It's out in West Dallas, across the Trinity River. It's in the middle of a great, big, huge government housing project. And neither the school nor the housing project was all that old. This would have been fall of 1975 when I was starting there. They were neither one very old, but they were in totally decrepit condition. I mean, doors hanging off. You'd look at the government housing project and there'd be doors hanging off the hinges and trash everywhere. It was a sight to see. But when you sign an unassigned contract, that's the kind of place. Somebody was trying to make me feel better one day, and they said, oh, Pinkston's not the worst, it's probably the third worst school in Dallas. And at that time, I think they had 18 high schools in Dallas, so this was a huge district. It was big enough that they had sub-districts within the district, and they each had their own warehouse and assistant superintendent for sub-district whatever. It was quite an experience. I got to the LG Pinkston High School and discovered that I was going to be a floating teacher. That meant I had no classroom to hang my hat in. I went when some other teacher that had a classroom was on their planning period. Here I came. You know, so I worked out of a briefcase that first year, part of that first year. I got to looking around, and right in the middle of the math department was an empty classroom. And so I was all excited. I go to the assistant principal at this high school. They had 4 assistant principals. And told him, I said, you know, I found an empty classroom. Oh, you know. He wasn't really willing to admit that at the time, but I finally convinced him that there might be one. He said, well, we'll check it out. Well, it took several weeks to check this thing out, but eventually I did get a classroom. You could look out the window at Texas Stadium. You could look out the window at the downtrodden government housing project and things like that. But I did at least have a room to hang my hat in. To give you an idea of what this school was like, it was a 4-year high school. There were 2,000 students in this high school, 70% black, 28% Mexican American, 2% other. I had one white kid the whole day long. Of this 2,000 student high school, 1,200 of them were freshmen. So the dropout rate was just enormous. By the time you got to senior year in high school, there wasn't much going on. I felt obligated enough. One time I decided the senior class was putting on a play. So I decided to go to this play one night. Not the part of town you really wanted to go to very often after hours, you know. But I went. And for the whole senior class, I was one of 12 people in the audience. And probably half of those were faculty members. So not even family would show up for these kids. It was a real eye-opener for this little kid from Liberal, Kansas that had veered through Nebraska on the way. I taught a class called Foundations of Math. And this was mostly freshmen that were in. I had one class of pre-algebra, and the rest of them were this Foundations of Math. And it was a push for these kids to be able to add anything. If the sum was 10 or less, they could probably get it most of the time because they could count on their fingers. A few of them were a little bit brighter. They might be able to get up to 20 because they figured out how to use their toes too. But these kids just, They'd been in school for 8 years and either nothing had been presented or nothing sunk in. I don't know which. There was a law in Texas at that time that you had to be in attendance, I think 65% of the time, to be able to receive a grade. Otherwise, you, by state mandate, received an F in the class. Well, I had a good 60 to 70% of my kids that got Fs simply because they were never there. You know, they didn't meet the mandatory requirement in attendance. So anyhow, that was quite an interesting experience. During that point in time, another one of my markers for me is that God nudged me to, I realized that I should start regularly going back to church. I had not been through my college days at all. And I went and visited and joined Highland Park United Methodist Church, which sits on the corner of the campus at SMU. At that point in time, one of their big deals was Tom Landry was a member there, and Tom Landry was the coach of the Dallas Cowboys in those days. Ultimately, George W. Bush became a member there, and I think that's where his membership might still be there. I don't know. But it was a very large church, and they were very aggressive to sign people up as members. The first day I attended, I probably checked some box that I might be interested in membership, something like that. And by 2 o'clock that afternoon, there was somebody knocking on my door. They signed me up as a member. That's really the last I ever heard of anything from anybody at that church. I continued to go. It was kind of interesting. They had great music. They had Leighton Farrell was the name of the pastor there at that time, and he preached a pretty good sermon. And so I did continue to do that, and that was probably a good thing that I did. Well, on the whole, the deal down in Dallas really wasn't a very good situation. I asked the district if I could find some coaching opportunities, and even with the background I had, the answer was no, can't do it. So I considered other options, and my hometown of Liberal, Kansas, needed a math teacher. They had ample opportunities for me to coach. So I returned to Liberal, to USD 480, and I taught at West Junior High. Taught 8th grade math 1 year and algebra 2 years of the 3 that I was there in Liberal. I also coached football, wrestling, and track. Football and track I'd been involved with. Wrestling I'd never done in my life, but the guy that had left the position that I took had a book, and so how to coach wrestling. So he left me with the book, and so I had actually been his assistant my first year. Between having experienced that and having a book, well, we came up with some wrestling exercises to get these guys going. I had some tremendous athletes, which helped a lot. I had 3 little black kids that were 3 weights in a row, and it was pin, pin, pin. I mean, they were undefeated and pinned everybody they wrestled. Well, you could rack up quite a few points that way, so we did pretty well. One of them, I know, went on and played football at K-State, so they were pretty good athletes. And I was very fortunate to have that. But while I was there in Liberal, the junior high was on the old property. There used to be an air base out in Liberal during the war, and it became their airport during that point in time, and the school was built on that property. So I had always wanted to do this, so I learned to fly while I was out there. I would go out before school and get some practice time in. I joined a flying club, which was pretty reasonable, had an instructor that was pretty reasonable. And so I did that, and that was a great experience. From my undergraduate days, I had always planned to be a school administrator. That was my goal. I wanted to be a school administrator. So right after I graduated up in Nebraska, I took a 8-hour summer course, something like that. But then I went 2 summers up to KU and got my master's degree up there while I was teaching out in Liberal. You know, I had to move clear across the state. One of my classes one summer I had to take was only offered in Kansas City, and that used to frost me just a little bit, that I moved all the way from Liberal to Lawrence, and then I had to commute to Kansas City to take one of my classes. But I got one of my I got my master's while I was up there, and got the degree in school administration. I think they call it educational leadership today or something to that effect, but it had me in a position that I could be a school administrator. I didn't quite at that point have enough hours to be a district level administrator, but I could be a building level administrator. So here's one of my markers, and this is just an unbelievable tale. I had, I mentioned I was coaching football out in Liberal, and my principal at West Junior High had played football at KU back in the 50s. So he sent me, I still have this today, went to a spring coaching clinic up at KU, and this was during Don Fambro's days. This would have probably been in 1978, somewhere along in there. Don Fambro was the head coach, John Hadel was the quarterback's coach, and a whole bunch of other names that probably none of us would recognize, but I was sent up there to attend this camp. Since I had finished my master's and I was wanting to be a school administrator, colleges, some of you are old enough to remember this, they used to have what they called placement offices. Now they call it career centers or whatever, but it was a placement office. So I had registered with the placement office at KU for an opportunity to become a school administrator. Well, while I was at this camp up at KU, the placement office at KU called my school back in Liberal, talked to my principal, said, "Hey, does this guy teach for you?" "Yeah." Said, "Well, we've got an opportunity we think might be good for him." And so he told him, he said, "Well, he's not here. In fact, he's up there." The placement office from KU actually came out onto the field for this coaching clinic and found me, which I've always, that's been a plus for KU over the years for me, that they would actually do that. And so they came and found me, and here's one of the more remarkable things of this story is I had taken a suit with me. Why would I take a suit anywhere, let alone to a football coaching clinic? Well, I did. And it just so happened the place that they were wanting me to go interview was Wathena, Kansas, about 80 miles from Lawrence. I'm already 400 miles across the state, so Wathena was good enough to get some board members together on the Saturday, I think it was, of that weekend, and I drove from Lawrence on up to Wathena, and I interviewed for the high school principals. It was a combination, junior high, high school principal's job in Wathena, Kansas. So, I took that job. I was 26 years old at the time, which in retrospect, that's way too young to do a job like that. But I was go-getter, gangbusters. And Wathena was a small little place. They didn't necessarily have the cream of the crop to pick from in, in a situation like that either. So I took that job, headed off to Wathena, Kansas to be a high school principal. Interesting experience. I was there for 3 years. It was not the best 3 years of my work life. It was okay for a while. There were times that really weren't okay. It was a tough little community in the bluffs of the Missouri River right across from St. Joseph, Missouri. It's in Donovan County. I mentioned Donovan County earlier, that this Grandpa Dodge of mine had been sent to at one point in time. It's very extreme hills. They have a lot of apple orchards up there, or they did at that time anyhow. You know, most little towns in Kansas have a grain elevator. Wathena did not have a grain elevator, but it had an apple house, so that the orchards could bring their produce into town. It got processed at the apple house, boxed up. They washed them, they waxed them, they boxed them, and off they went to the market. So a whole lot different than where I had grown up out in southwest Kansas. Besides that, the humidity level was about way up here. And that was just one of the things. Give you an idea of what it's like to be a principal in a junior or senior high. Especially during basketball season. You have junior high games on Monday and Thursday. You have high school games on Tuesday and Friday. and then occasionally a tournament or a music program or something like that on Saturdays. Well, believe it or not, even back in those days, Wednesday night was pretty sacred still. Not so much anymore, but that was left for church activities. You know, you start real early in the morning, you're going till late at night. One example, one evening there was a 7th grade girls B team basketball game. And at the end of regulation time, the score was tied 4-4. I'd been there since 6:30 that morning, you know, and I probably did learn to pray just a little bit right then, because I was praying, just let somebody score, you know. Just let somebody score, because there were probably 2 or 3 more games to go after this one. That was the first one. So anyhow, those are some of the things that went on. During that point in time, I was still working towards my long-term goal of probably to be a superintendent of schools. So I had gotten into and was working on my doctorate at KU in school administration. That's probably about a 90-hour program, 60 of which would have been classroom and 30 of it research. And I got about halfway through the classroom part of it before I had a career change. So I had 3 teaching and school-related experiences. While I was up at Wathena still, probably one of the biggest markers in my life was this. When I went to church up there, I went to a church in St. Joe, Missouri called Huffman Memorial United Methodist Church. And it just so happened, those of you that know my wife today, Lynn, she was Lynn Gunn at that time. She's from the Gunn clan in Scotland. And she's not Scottish, but her family heritage is there. She also went there occasionally. Usually she went with a friend to a little Methodist church out in the country, but that didn't work out that day, so she attended this church. So I was sitting behind her about 3 or 4 rows that day. And of course I was kind of scanning around, watching things, and all of a sudden my eye caught this young gal about my age sitting by herself. And so, you know, every time we sang a song, we'd stand up, and I was looking real closely to see if she had any kind of ring on her finger or anything like that. And she didn't have. So I was trying to work up my courage, you know, how can I try to meet this girl? You know, the opportunities like that don't come along very often. So anyhow, church was over, and I decided, well, maybe I can kind of introduce myself to her on the way out or something. Well, I stood there a little bit, and she started talking to some people that she'd been sitting close to. And so I waited, and she talked. And I waited some more. And then she talked some more, and finally she started working her way out, so I worked my way out to the foyer, the narthex they called it there. And I was kind of oddly waiting outside in the narthex, and she just kept talking to people. So finally, they had a side door out of that, and it had a ramp. It was a wheelchair ramp, but I could tell that she was going that way, and so I went out that door and I started walking down the ramp really slowly. And she got up beside me. I wasn't going fast enough for her, so she got up beside me, and I stuck my hand out. Very uncharacteristic of me. I'm more of an introvert than I am an extrovert. But I stuck my hand out and said, "Hi, I'm Bob Keesling. I don't like to eat Sunday dinner alone. Would you care to join me?" Where did that come from, you know? But more surprising was her answer. She said, "Well, yeah, I will." So we went, there was a restaurant called the Swiss Chalet, and we went there, and it was very fortunate. They had an all-you-could-eat buffet, and that was a good deal. As the more I got to know Lynn, that really was a good deal, and they more than that, they had an all-you-could-eat dessert buffet at the same time. So that proved to be a pretty good deal. Well, things were going pretty well with us. I had ordered a suit. She couldn't remember what my name was. I'd ordered a suit at a A.J. August clothing store, and I think there used to be one of those here in Wichita. And I decided, well, if you don't mind, it was close to this restaurant. I said, I want to stop by and pick this up. So I did, and she, brightly enough, she realized there was a tag on this suit. So she kind of looked at the tag a little bit, and found out what my name was. So it worked pretty well. We were getting along really well, and you know, I was deciding I wanted to do something about this. My mother had actually sent me a letter, "Don't let this one get away," you know. Well, you know, if Mom says, well, probably I'd better do something about that. So I planned an evening. We were going to go down to the plaza in Kansas City, which, you know, took about an hour, a little over an hour from where we lived to get down there. And I think we ate at an Italian restaurant, and then I was going to take Lynn out on one of these carriage rides that goes around the plaza at night. Well, we did so. The catch was, it was about like it was out here this morning. It was about 10, 15 degrees, something like that. Well, the carriage rides, they'd give you a blanket, but that still wasn't enough. So I like to tease Lynn that I kept her on there. I told her the only way I'd let her get off the carriage was if she said yes. So I proposed, she said yes, and we got back inside where it was a whole lot warmer. But during the months that followed, both of us quit our jobs. I quit as principal at Wathena. Lynn was a speech therapist over in St. Joe, and she just wasn't real thrilled with that either. And so we both quit our jobs, and then we went home to tell our parents, hey, we're getting married. Oh, by the way, we quit our jobs. You know, they had to think, what are these guys up to? Well, anyhow, we had done that. I realized that I needed to find something to provide for my new wife, and so I was applying for jobs, applied for principalships in Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. And I actually was getting quite a few interviews. I wasn't getting much in the way of job offers. I did get one offer down in Oklahoma, a little town of Nowata, Oklahoma, northeastern part of the state. And I had, on my visit down there, yeah, they have no water there. So the superintendent was taking me around, and we came to the football field, and here was this huge 8-10 foot cyclone fence with coiled barbed wire on top of it. And you know, I was kind of looking at it, and the superintendent could tell I was kind of looking at it, and he said, you're probably wondering what that's there for. And I said, well, yeah. And he said, our fans have gotten so rowdy here that the State Activities Association will not allow us to have a home game with fans in the stadium. They could have home games, but they couldn't, nobody could come watch them. You know, I thought, I need a job, but I don't think this is the right place here. So I declined on that. But one day, my superintendent, his name was Charlie Watkins. He was a World War II vet, one of those great characters that came out of World War II, went into teaching. You were one of the few male teachers, and so you immediately became the superintendent of schools, you know. So that was the route he took. I'm pretty sure that there's a Watkins that just won the congressional race, District 2, I think it is, out of Topeka area up there. Steve Watkins, I kind of think he's Charlie's grandson. But Charlie had really bad rheumatoid arthritis. His fingers were off like that. His toes went off at an angle like that. And it was kind of hard for him to walk. So Charlie came sauntering over to my office. We were all in one building. He came sauntering over to my office one day, and we were chatting school stuff. And he said, so have you found a job yet? I said, well, no, I've had a lot of interviews, but not really any solid offers that I can do anything with yet. And he said, well, I don't know if you'd be interested or not, but he said, I just had a salesman from Superior School Supplies in here, and he told me that this was going to be the last time he would be there because he was taking a different job within the company. I said, so he said, I don't know if you'd be interested in something like that, but you know, there might be something there if you want. Oh, okay. So we finished our discussion, and Charlie no more than walked out my room, and I was spinning my chair around. I had a Superior catalog on my bookcase back there. I found a phone number. I put in a phone call, and to make a long story short, not only was I interested in that, but they were interested in me. So I took a career change. It kind of overlapped a little bit. We dealt with schools, so that was a good place for me to get into the business world. And they were also interested in me because of my experience in the school world. So that worked out pretty well. I started out in sales, had a very large territory for 2 years. We'd planned to move to Manhattan, of all places, but we never could sell, of all places, yeah. We never could sell our house in Wathena. This was 1982, and the Reagan economy wasn't quite fully kicked in yet. That area of the world would have been behind the curve anyhow. It was not a very economically strong place, and we couldn't sell our house. So we ended up living for 2 years in Wathena still. I did more driving than I would have had to living in Manhattan, but it worked out okay. Then along came Superior again, and they wanted me to come to Wichita to manage the operation here. Well, that was pretty appealing to both of us. And so Lynn had gone to a business school and was working as a legal secretary at that time. We moved to Wichita. She continued to do that for a little while. But right as we were needing to move to Wichita, we were trying to figure out, what are we going to do with this house up here? Well, just like that, somebody showed up, looked at the house, made an offer, and we were able to sell it. You know, unbelievable. So we moved to Wichita. Lynn was working as a legal secretary. I was working for Superior. I worked for Superior for 26 years altogether. It was a great job. It allowed me a lot of flexibility with my family. If I needed to be at something at school, I just did it. And little travel, but not way too much, so it was great. Adam was born, our son Adam, who's a doctor now, was born in 1985. Leading up to that, I can tell you one story. We thought Lynn was pregnant, and so we had one of these home tests for pregnancy, and she handed the little test tube to me, and I was supposed to put it in this stand to see if it changed color, and my hand was shaking just like that because we weren't ready for this yet, you know. But it worked out that way. Adam was born. He was born at 4.5 pounds, pretty small. They would still let the women stay in the hospital for a while at that point in time, and I think this was on about the 3rd day that Lynn was about to be dismissed, and so we were in her room packing her stuff up, getting ready to take our new baby home. Well, while we were standing there, there was an announcement came over the loudspeaker, "Code Blue, Well Baby Nursery, Code Blue, Well Baby Nursery." Well, I didn't know what that meant, but we come to find out that it was not a good thing. It meant somebody was not breathing in the Well Baby Nursery, and it happened to be our son. Well, he did not go home with us that day. Lynn was able to, but fortunately there was an attentive nurse in there, and she saw this baby that was not breathing, and help arrived. We had a flurry of doctors that came around, and among the things one doctor was telling us, you know, we don't know how long he might have been without oxygen. We don't know what might be. He said there could be some thing, you know, maybe he won't understand algebra or something like that. Well, he fortunately was able to do that, didn't have that kind of thing. But leading up to that, I had gone through, this was before the days of spreadsheets, or for me anyhow, before the days of spreadsheets, but I had paperwork in front of me. I tried to figure out how we were going to survive having a child. And the only way we were going to make it was if Lynn continued to work. So this had a little priority setting in our lives. Our son needed mom at home. Adam stayed in the hospital for 16 days. They eventually let him go home. We had to go spend the night at the hospital so we could prove to them that we were able to take care of this kid that was on a monitor and all those kind of things. So we lived with that for a while. It was kind of hard in the fact that we had already been home for a couple weeks, and then all of a sudden, you know, we'd kind of gotten back into our day-to-day life, and then all of a sudden we had to bring a kid into it, you know. You had to stop and think about a whole lot of things. So anyhow, while I was working for Superior during that stage of my life, one of the most significant events in my life came about. And I've talked about people that I stand on their shoulders. And one of them's here today. And that's Arden, right there. We were in an Optimist Club together along with Marlo. We were members of the same Optimist Club. And I've always tried to use this as an example that God can use you outside of the walls of the church right here. Arden came to me after an Optimist Club meeting one day. He had a little brochure in his hand and he said, I would like for you to consider doing this, which was the Walk to Emmaus. So I said, oh, okay. Well, I'll take it home and look at it. So I went home and talked to my wife, and I told her, I said, Arden thinks we ought to do this. And I had such respect for him that made me want to do it. Lynn was a little more hesitant. She hadn't had that involvement that I did. But anyhow, we did that. This was in 1994. And several of you I know have had the Walk to Emmaus experience in here. And everybody's is different. Yours would not be like mine and mine not like somebody else's. But this had an enormous impact on my life. It's a 3-day weekend event. You do it once. You have the opportunity to help afterwards, where you can be parts of teams. Actually, I did some talks along the way, which was my first experience to kind of learn to be in front of a group when I wasn't the principal or something like that. This really is where I got my first exposure to prevenient grace. And it has been an enormous part of my life and my wife's life, and therefore my children's lives as well. So anyhow, that if you haven't done that, find somebody that's been involved with Emmaus, and you may just want to consider doing something like that. From my involvement there, I took on another little task here. I went to a lay speaker school in 1999, and this happened to be up in the Salina district. The pastor at the church we were attending right then told me, he said, wisely, he said, you know, if you want to do this, you might want to go do the one up in the Salina district. He said, it's a lot better than the one here in Wichita. And so I did. It was at the Webster Conference Camp Center just outside of Salina. And if you will notice, look down in that lower right-hand corner right there. It says director, and there's a signature, Reverend Rick Just. That was my first exposure to Rick from 1999. And he was the director of that academy, Lay Ministry Academy, Lay Speaker School. And it was just a great experience. The camp was a great place to have it. There was, 30 or 40 people. Here's the group that was there for a long weekend. And we just did great things. We learned things about lay speaking. We worshiped together. We did things. I came to appreciate Victory in Jesus that weekend with the guy playing a guitar. There was an older lady in the group, and Rick was asking for hymn selections. Well, they just lost her husband a few months before, and they'd sung Victory in Jesus at his funeral, and she wanted that again. Well, if you can only imagine, it was pretty special. Right over there, even 20 years ago, I was gray-headed, white-headed. I blend into the limestone background right there. But look in the middle of this thing. Look at that young pastor from Salina right there. Huh?
Nice gels, too.
Anyhow, that was a great experience. I did a little bit of lay speaking for a while, and then kind of let that go by the wayside. My work experience continued with Superior, but we reached a point in 2008. It was mostly another guy and myself that owned most of the business at that time, and it was time to sell. Well, 2008, if you remember, wasn't the best time in the economic life of our country to try to be selling a business, but we did. Our business was diverse enough that we had trouble finding a single buyer. We had retail stores. We had a couple here in Wichita. Over the years, we had them in Lawrence, Topeka, Salina, and even Dodge City. But that was kind of one part of the business. We had an institutional sales part that we sold directly to schools. People that do retail don't want to do that part. But then the biggest part of our business was we had a software division where we created software for school lunch programs. It was a point of service program where they have a lot of requirements because they get government reimbursement, and they have to keep track of who's going through, are they free or reduced or anything. Free and reduced parents have to apply for it, so software was developed to help facilitate that process. We had a easy school pay was what we called it, that they could pay online, put money on their kids' lunch card, things like that. That was a big part of our business. We had customers in 44 states for that. Well, we sold the retail to one part, the institutional to another part. The software part went to this company called Harris School Solutions. It was a Canadian company. Software, that's all they did. They did a lot of things besides school parts, but this was the part that bought our business, and they kept me on for about 15 months. I knew it wouldn't be forever, but I didn't know exactly how long it would be, and I got a phone call one day telling me that it was time. So, you know, Canadians can be pretty brutal. I don't know if any of you have ever worked with them, but they're pretty tough. They're pretty tough. Well, then I was still about 57 years old at that point, something like that. I didn't really want to just quit everything at that point in time, so I looked into some opportunities, and this is what we do today. We've done it for almost 10 years now. We bought a couple of vacant Liberty tax territories from Brad Williams, who used to go to Asbury Church. There's a few of you that would know Brad. He lives out in Arizona now, but we did that, and we still do that through today. I mentioned earlier my great-great-great-grandpa, Jonas Dodge, Reverend Jonas Dodge, the guy that came from New York to Kansas. I have a book of his, and you can probably tell this book is old. And I was looking through this while I was trying to put this presentation together, and this says textbook on it right here. What he did was record the scripture that he used when he preached at different places. So I was looking for one about this time of year, and I found this one, November 6th of 1840. And being a circuit rider, probably at that time, he was assigned to a circuit near Newark. Now, I first thought this was Newark, New Jersey, but I looked on the map, and there is a Newark, New York, which would be consistent. It's kind of between Rochester and Syracuse, just north of the Finger Lakes area of New York a little bit. And as you might expect, this was at somebody's home, the Gorsline family. It was at there. Each week he would record what his scripture was and where it was at, and almost invariably it would be somebody's home, or it might be a courthouse, it might be a schoolhouse, things like that. But as I was looking at this, he didn't have use of the Message back in those days in 1840, but this was his text for that day, Proverbs 24:30-34. One day I walked by the field of an old lazybones, and then past the vineyard of a lout. They were overgrown with weeds, thick with thistles, all the fences broken down. I took a long look and pondered what I saw. The fields preached me a sermon, and I listened. A nap here, a nap there, a day off here, a day off there. Sit back, take it easy. Do you know what comes next? Just this. You can look forward to a dirt poor life with poverty as your permanent house guest. I got to thinking, you know, if I could have heard Grandpa Dodge's sermon back in the day, I might have taken a little different course through parts of my life. I bet there were people that heard that sermon that day that might have changed their life a little bit. I mentioned earlier not having had a conversion experience. I can tell you this. I reached a point during my walk that I realized I had not given 100% to God. So I did. I got on my knees and I said, God, I need to give you everything that's me. And I did that, and I will never regret having done that. And I realize that there's a whole lot of us go through the motions, and I'm still guilty of that too, but a whole lot of us go through the motions, but we're not giving it that 100% that God expects out of us. Earlier I mentioned being a lifelong Methodist, but that hasn't kept me from being frustrated with that denomination at various times. I'm in my third cycle right now. My first cycle was several years back. I was very frustrated with it. I was attending a church that I wasn't getting much support from my point of view, like I do here at Asbury. I came out of that one when I attended the Walk to Emmaus. That helped me realize that I wasn't alone with this, that there were other Methodists out there that wanted things done the right way too. So that was number one. The second time we had decided to stay at the church we were at. It was, we felt like, Lynn and I did, that we should stay and keep the conservative point of view as alive as we could there. But then it started spilling into our children. They were getting old enough and they were getting fed crap, if you will, in their youth activities that we just couldn't live with anymore. So what do? We visited a lot of churches. We ended up here at Asbury. That was my second frustration point. God took care of me on that one too. The third one I'm at right now, we all know what's going on in our denomination and the big event coming up in February. But you know what? God is going to bail us out of this one too. It's not going to be because of the great things we do, but it's going to be because of the great things that He does, that He's going to bail us out of that. So I'm convinced that there is something that will work. There is a future that involves Jesus Christ at the center of it. How different would my life have been had God not been pursuing me? Therefore, I believe that prevenient grace must be real. So anyhow, thank you guys. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Now it's your big job.
Well, guys, thank you so much. We'll see you next month, and see you in church tomorrow.